great to be with you all, albeit sad not to be with you in person over this week. I've been part of ELF, I was part of ELF the first time a couple of years ago and really benefited in the foundational disciple making track. And it's lovely to join this group as well. And I'll be dipping in and out of this group over the week. I've got a couple of other sessions in other networks as well. And just as a way of introduction, my role is with the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. Michael, who's part of this group, is a minister in that denomination, and I've been working in this job for the last 5 years, which is really training and resourcing churches to think about disciple making. I love doing it, and I live near Belfast as well with my wife Sarah and 2 little boys. So lockdown has been both fun and and I said in the small group, and I've been enjoying and enduring it, I think. But I want to ask you a question. I'm going to do a little bit of teaching up front, and then there'll be a space in a little bit for some personal reflection and maybe some sharing from the group. And then I'll share a little bit more. And then what we'll do is we'll jump into our breakout rooms again, and we'll consider some scenarios to really try to earth what I'm talking about at the start as well. So my question is, how do you view discipleship? Because how we view anything actually affects how we use it or how we do it. So I wonder if we view discipleship or disciple making as being about programs, or we see it as being personal. I wonder, do we treat it as an optional extra or as an essential element at the core of what we do? I wonder if we see it as something that's organized or something that's organic. How we view discipleship will affect how we disciple people. So what I want to do in this session is explore an image that Paul gives for how we can view discipleship, and it's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I would encourage you to maybe look it up with us with me, and I'll read it. And it's going to be 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 to 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 to 9. And this is Paul writing to the Corinthians. He writes this: what after all, verse 5, what after all is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor. For we are fellow workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. Just read verse 9 again. For we are fellow workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. So my question again, how do you view discipleship? Because how we view something affects how we use it. Perhaps some people might view discipleship as something like a factory. I guess with a factory, there's a straightforward formula. You put all the right stuff in at one end, and you get what you want out at the other end, or at least that's how it's meant to work. And the focus in a factory is passing all the right instructions out to the factory workers. And if everyone does what they are meant to do, then that will lead to the desired outcome. And I wonder if maybe too often, or there's a temptation to view disciple making as a factory, put all the right things in at one end, and at the other end, out will pop a disciple. And we probably know, or maybe we smile at that, we probably know in our heads that it's not like this in reality. But perhaps we can get so consumed in getting the programs or the products or the processes in place that we miss the need for the personal, for the people, and for proximity to those people as well. But what if discipleship is much more like farming in a field? The picture of a farmer who gets the soil right, who uproots the weeds, who plants the seeds, who waters it. And I guess with a field, it can be unpredictable, can't it? And it's important to react to circumstances as they arise. It probably involves observing the crop, assessing the conditions, and tending to the needs. And it requires time, it requires patience, but after a while, you may begin to see little shoots, green shoots of growth. And even then, more watering and effort will be required. And sometimes it's frustrating, and sometimes it's fruitful. And sometimes growth is obvious, but often it can be hidden. And the imagery that Paul is using here in 1 Corinthians 3 is equating spiritual growth to the work of a farmer and his field. So what can we learn from this for our own disciple making? There's lots, but I want to just suggest and hone in on three for the next few moments. Firstly, I think it shows us that disciple making involves both reliance and responsibility. Reliance and responsibility. Paul leaves us in no doubt in this passage about who makes things grow. He says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. And so that should be an encouragement to us, but also a challenging reminder about whose hands we leave this in. But as I read this verse, I'm also struck that there was still a need for someone to plant, and there was still a need for someone to water. God made it grow, but Paul planted and Apollos watered. And it strikes me that there can be two opposite and potentially equally dangerous approaches to disciple making. One approach is to say, well, God does the growing, so I don't need to do much. I'll pray or I'll pay and I'll stay. And in some ways it displays reliance on God, but it misses out our responsibility. And the other approach is, I'll do it all and leave no room for God. I'll work and I'll labor and I'll do and I'll get the programs and the products right. And it takes responsibility, but it misses reliance. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they each will be rewarded according to their own labor. For we are fellow workers in God's service. You are God's field. It's God who makes things grow. At his command, in his power, in his time, in his way. But as fellow workers like Paul, we plant, and we water, and we labor, and we watch, and we pray. So on one hand, the danger might be, and I'll get you to reflect on this in a moment, the danger might be that you have become reliant on a discipleship product to enable growth, or you've become reliant on a good program, or even great preaching. But you might need to rediscover a reliance on God in these things. Or on the other hand, while we should always maintain a reliance on God in all we do, perhaps you need to become more intentional with the people you're seeking to disciple. I think intentional was a word that was used earlier. To assume more responsibility as you seek to lead them spiritually. We need a balance on reliance and responsibility. Secondly, if disciple making is like a field, then that means it's unpredictable and it's frustrating. And it strikes me that after several years of closely walking with Jesus, even the very first disciples were still getting it wrong. They argued about who was the greatest. Others fell asleep when they should have been praying, and some were doubting while the rest were worshipping in Matthew 28. And even at the end, some were still asking Jesus, when was he going to restore the kingdom of Israel? It was like they still hadn't grasped it. One betrayed him, one denied knowing him, and one disbelieved the resurrection. You see, growth is rarely linear, and it's much more up and down. It was 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and yet over time, growth occurred, and these disciples were formed and leaders were made. And I don't know how you find yourself today in your disciple-making efforts, perhaps. Maybe that's encouraging for you to hear today, that there are struggles and there are scars in disciple-making. In some ways, we need to learn to deal with disappointment in those that we disciple at times. And Jesus experienced this. But farmers are patient with their crops. They know it takes time for a field to grow or for fruit to form. It reminds me of the words of Jesus in John 15, which was being shared in our own online church service this morning. Every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. Fruitfulness takes time, and farming might be frustrating, but time and patience are needed. And so too with disciple making. We need to be patient with those we're seeking to disciple, to walk alongside, to maybe gently prune, to show patience. Farming is messy, and a farmer needs to be prepared to get involved in the mess of their field. So take your time, embrace the unpredictability, the messes, the frustrations, be consistent in your relationship and constant in your challenge. Go for the slow growth and trust the farmer. And finally, for this section, if disciple making is like a field, then it's going to require flexibility. And this will launch us into the session a little bit, or the second half of the session later. But the work of a farmer involves tending and watering, and perhaps most importantly, watching. It's important for the farmer to know the conditions and be able to tend to the field in its various seasons. There's no one size fits all in discipling, because everyone's life and context is different. So there's no set formula to follow. And if you came for that to this network, then you might be disappointed. But there is a need to respond to situations as they arise in those that we disciple. Again, consider how many lessons Jesus taught his disciples as they were traveling along a road. Look at that fig tree, he said, or see that city on a hill. Or how Jesus discipled through interruptions that came his way, pausing with a woman in need when he was late to a pretty important appointment, responding to the question of who is my neighbour, or sitting down with the disciples after their mission trip of Luke 9 and 10 to debrief their experiences and their frustrations and the failures. He wasn't following a formula, but he was being flexible. An example of this in my own disciple making recently has been responding to the challenges of the coronavirus crisis. For the small group that my wife and I lead through our church, we met online that first week of lockdown, and there were tears and there was much anxiety. And we normally meet fortnightly, but that night we committed to meeting weekly online for a short time each week. And in those early weeks, we prayed more together and shared how each other was doing. And in some ways, we emphasized and took a more pastoral approach than we normally do with maybe more in-depth Bible study. And even after a few weeks, I sensed people were finding life quite intense, and our conversation was intense. And so the next week I said, let's just do a quiz to lighten the mood and to have fun together. In some ways, what we were trying to do was assess the need at the time, what was right for the moment, and to respond to that. I think disciple making, it's good to have a general plan and be intentional in our direction, but we're also dealing with people and we need flexibility in our approach. So just to kind of close this time, I think discipleship is less a factory to operate and much more a field to farm. It's much less a program to run, and it's much more about a path to walk. It's less about resources to use, as helpful as they can be, and much more about rhythms that we can help people to develop. And it's much less about downloading the right information and much more about developing habits that lead to transformation. But I want to explore this idea of what I've come to call differentiated discipleship, which I think is really, I guess, a phrase that has come into my mind this year. I suppose because of the context of my work, it's often working with lots and lots of different contexts of churches and realizing that there is no one size fits all. But I've smiled a little bit because of Jay's running analogy, because I have a running analogy now too. I do a little bit of running as well. I was out this morning too, very early on. And but over the last few years, I've been a member of 2 different running clubs. And one club is really small with 25 members and only a few people at weekly training. And we train together and there's brilliant unity among us and everyone knows one another and we're all at a fairly similar standard and stage and we bring one another on. And there aren't that many new members. So because it's quite hard for newcomers to come into a very small and tight-knit group and people who are maybe at a certain level of running. And so they often get left behind or maybe can't manage the training. The other club that I was once part of has grown significantly over the past few years and now have around 300 runners. And so you turn up on a Monday night at a training session and there's about 10 or 12 different varieties of groups, and you can choose different paces and lengths and to run, and there's an active social scene and about 200 people there, and it's amazing. But it's hard maybe to get to know people individually in such a big group as well, and to have very specialized training as well. And here's the thing, both of those running clubs, if you ask them, are really happy with the way they are. It sounds like churches, doesn't it? The one maybe wants to get people started running and have lots and lots of runners, and the other is happy to be a small, close-knit club with a good level of running ability. And as a result, both clubs attract a certain type of runner. But it got me thinking, how might we be able to do both? How do we help some people start jogging? Tom's question earlier on actually has been, I guess, resonates with me in that. How do we help some people start jogging while encouraging others in their discipleship or faith to go further than they ever have before? How do we help some people, some disciples, learn to jog and get started? And how do we help some disciples to go faster and further by helping them accelerate on their journey of faith? Neil Hudson from the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity, he describes discipleship in this phrase. He says it's about equipping people to follow Jesus in the here and now. And I really like that. But in order to do that, then we need to have a recognition that the here and now for those that we disciple is varied. So that's why I've come up with this phrase, differentiated discipleship. I guess some questions. How might we be able to equip people for the various ages and stages of their lives? What might be helpful to people at some places depending on their age or stage? How can we disciple people in the normal rhythms and routines of our church life? But also, how do we disciple across the board, but also down through the years, and also be mindful of pace? For example, what a brand new believer needs is probably different than someone who has been following Jesus for 30 years. I've often heard it said that churches sometimes measure success by the ABC, the attendance, the buildings, and the cash. But actually, we shouldn't be measuring success by the ABC, but by the D of discipleship, by how we are helping people to grow in their faith. And some years ago, I came across this helpful graphic, which I think I'll be showing. The first image is perhaps how many people view the church. But one image is how many people view the church. There's red dots in the corner, and they're huddled together at the edge of a society that are increasingly uninterested in God. They're small in number, and they're together, and they're desperately shining their light and holding on to who they are. But the second image, which I saw, is another way of viewing the church. It's the same number of red dots, but this time they are scattered all among the grey. And I guess it's trying to be mindful that those that we disciple are in different walks of life. They're in different ages and stages. They're in the midst of workplaces and sports clubs and neighborhoods. So we don't just disciple people for the church, but we disciple people for the whole of their lives. And when I say the church, I mean the gathered kind of meeting. If I was to ask you where the church was on a Sunday, you could give me an answer. Well, maybe now you can't in this crisis, but where is your church throughout the week? It's in offices and shops and homes and coffee shops and sports teams and community centres whenever they're open. Those we disciple might be teaching children or managing a business or attending university. So what are the particular challenges or opportunities that they have both for discipleship and growth and to live out their faith in those environments as well? So how can we equip people to integrate their faith into all the tasks of their week whether it's as secretaries or students, lawyers or parents, neighbourhoods, or even those in retirement.